Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and thank you so much for being here with me tonight. Before you drift off into a peaceful slumber, I invite you to wrap yourself in a blanket, dim the lights, and prepare to be gently carried away by tonight's story. This evening, we're taking a slow, dreamy journey back to the Middle Agesto, a quiet village called Eldergrove, where the world once stood still during the darkest time in history, the Black Death. But this isn't a tale of fear. It's a story of quiet resilience, whispered prayers, and the soft ember of hope that flickered even when the night felt endless. If you enjoy relaxing stories that help you wind down, please take just a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly means the world and helps others find a little peace before bed, just like you. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the world begins to quiet around you, I wish you the sweetest dreams. May this gentle story guide you into deep, restful sleep. Let's begin. In a land where cobblestone lanes wound through sleepy villages and thatched roofs slouched beneath the weight of time, there stood a wooden clock that had never once missed its beat. It lived at the heart of Eldergrovia, small hamlet tucked between the low hills of old Europe, where the lavender fields danced softly in the wind and the rivers murmured as though dreaming. Eldergrove was the kind of place where winters arrived gently and summers stayed long enough to befriend you. The year was 1346, though time was not yet counted in horror. Children still played with hoops and sticks under golden skies, and old women hummed tunes while crushing herbs in clay mortars. The villagers of Eldergrove lived slowly and fully, nestled in a rhythm older than stone. Their faith was stitched into each day, like embroidery, along the edges of a favorite cloak. Prayers at dawn, candlelight at dusk, and always the sound of the wooden clock ticking gently from the chapel tower. This clock, carved from blackened oak and inlaid with quiet brass, was said to have been built by a blind monk in the year of rain. No one remembered his name, only that he had whispered blessings into the wood with every turn of the chisel. And so, the clock never lied. Its hands moved like breath, never rushing, never faltering. The villagers called it the heart of Eldergrove, for it had outlived wars, fires, and even the long drought that dried up the mill pond for a whole season. In the home beside the chapel, a girl named Linnea awoke to its ticking. She was 13, with hair the color of wheat in early autumn and eyes like faded violets. Her hands were always stained with lavender and dust, for her grandmother, Mela, was the village herbalist, and Linnea was her only apprentice. While other girls embroidered silk ribbons or learned the lute, Linnea roamed the meadows collecting yarrow and nettle, or helped deliver babies with chamomile on her breath. That morning, Linnea felt something peculiar in the wind. It wasn't the scent of Changino. Eldergrove had seen many changes before. This was something quieter, like a whisper from behind the trees, or the hush before a hawk strikes from above. Still, she brushed it aside like cobweb on a windowsill. There was always work to be done. Spring fever had taken hold of several children, and Mela needed more elderflower and willow bark. Downstairs, Mela was already grinding dried petals with a patient rhythm. Her hands, gnarled as tree roots, moved with the assurance of someone who knew which leaves soothed the belly and which one stopped a wound from bleeding. She looked up as Linnea descended. "You dreamt of crows again," Mela said, not asking but stating. Linnea hesitated. "Just one, on the chapel's roof." It was staring at the clock. Mela nodded, pressing more herbs into the mortar. "The old ones say crows see beyond the veil. If it watches the clock, something is stirring." Linnea sat beside her and helped separate the herbs. "What kind of something?" Mela didn't answer. Outside, the village was waking slowly. Chickens clucked from behind low fences, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the baker's chimney. The air still smelled of dew and the ashes of last night's hearth. But in the east, above the far hills, the sky wore a strange cast like tarnished silver instead of blue. Later that day, A rider appeared at the village edge. His horse was lean, his cloak ragged, and his eyes so hollow they seemed to echo. He carried no sword, no goods, only a crumpled scroll and a bell tied to his saddle. The bell did not ring. Father Thorn, the chapel priest, came to greet him, and the man handed him the scroll without a word. His hands shook, and he turned back down the path before the villagers could ask his name. Linnea watched from the edge of the green, her heart oddly still. Father Thorn opened the scroll slowly, his face folding in on itself as he read. When he looked up, his voice wavered like a candle in wind. A sickness has come. Ships from the east carry it. Cities are falling to it like dry leaves in fire. We are advised to stay still, stay clean, stay apart. He looked toward the horizon where the rider had disappeared. God have mercy. Silence fell like frost over Eldergrove. Mothers clutched their children closer, and the baker forgot to take the bread from the oven. The only sound was the soft, steady ticking of the chapel clock. That night, Linnea could not sleep. The air had thickened somehow, like water before a storm. She walked barefoot to the window and looked out over the village. The rooftops were quiet, the trees unmoving, yet the stars above flickered like anxious candles. Behind her, Mela stirred in sleep and murmured a name Linnea had never heard before. Aracel. She turned, curious, but did not wake her. Instead, she watched the chapel. The clock's hands glowed faintly in the moonlight, still ticking, still faithful. But the whisper in her chest had grown louder, as if time itself had begun to shiver. The morning that followed was gentle in its light, but not in its feeling. The sun rose behind a veil of pale mist, painting Eldergrove in diluted gold and bone-white fog. The lavender fields, usually brimming with bees, lay quiet as if holding their breath. Linnea stepped outside with a basket in hand, headed toward the meadow path, but paused. Even the bird song, usually crisp and insistent, was distant, like a memory wrapped in cotton. She felt it again, that hush in the world. Not silence. No. Silence had always felt safe to her, like a cozy room in winter. But this hush was something else. Something watching. She tried to shake the feeling, adjusting her shawl and continuing on toward the elder grove, where the oldest trees grew, trees that, Mela said, had seen more winters than the chapel stones themselves. There, she picked leaves in clusters of 3, careful not to take too many from any single branch. The earth smelled sweet beneath her bare feet. But even here, the insects seemed hesitant. The bees buzzed lazily, almost confused. She was halfway through filling her basket when she heard the thud of hooves on the distant path. Linnea turned, shielding her eyes. Another horse. Another rider. But this one was younger, his cloak deep green, face flushed from travel, and his boots thick with road dust. He rode without hurry, but without pause either. And when he reached the village square, he did not dismount. Instead, he raised a scroll and spoke, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. By order of His Grace, Lord Denbar of Westmere, all villages are to report signs of illness. Anyone found harboring symptoms must be isolated at once. No gatherings are to take place. No church bells are to be rung, lest they invite panic. Any disregard will be punishable by rope or flame. He tossed the scroll to the ground and left without awaiting a reply. There was no seal on the parchment, no ribbon, just ink and the coldness of command. The villagers gathered around it like sheep circling an unfamiliar stone. No one spoke at first. Then Father Thorn picked it up with both hands, eyes heavy. So, he said softly, it has spread further than the ports. Mela, who had appeared behind Linnea, nodded once. It always does. Linnea looked up at her grandmother. Will it come here? Mela placed a hand on Linnea's shoulder. Even shadows need roads, child. We can only pray ours are too narrow to find. That night, Eldergrove was quieter than ever before. No laughter from the alehouse. No singing from the candle shop. Even the dogs slept without barking. Inside their stone cottage, Mela prepared satchels of dried thyme, rosemary, and clove smoke herbs, she called them. She instructed Linnea to burn a pinch each day near the hearth, and another at the window. Smoke can confuse spirits, she explained gently. And sickness is a spirit of sorts, one that loves stillness. They worked together under candlelight, measuring powder, tying bundles with string, whispering prayers between knots. It felt like they were preparing for winter, but not the kind with snow. Later, Mela pulled down an old wooden box from the shelf behind her cot. Its surface was worn smooth with age, its corners rounded like river stones. Linnea had never seen it opened. Mela placed it on the table. Your grandfather made this, long before you were born. Linnea tilted her head. What's inside? Mela hesitated, then opened the lid. Inside were scrolls parchment, old enough to crumble at the edges, tied with faded ribbons and marked with small painted sigils. One scroll bore the same mark as the chapel's clock. These, Mela said, are tales from the last time the world changed. Linnea looked at her wide-eyed. You mean this has happened before? Mela nodded slowly. Many years ago, before Eldergrove had a name, before our trees wore bark thick enough to survive frost. There was a sickness then, too. It came like a whisper in the wind just like now. She handed Linnea a scroll. The ribbon was soft as moss. Linnea read the first lines aloud, quietly. We did not hear the danger at first, for it wore no boots and sang no song. It crept beneath windows and settled in firewood, and by the time we saw it, the stars themselves wept. She looked up, heart racing. Who wrote this? Mela smiled faintly. Your great-great-grandmother. She wrote it when she was your age. The candlelight flickered. Outside, the clock ticked. And far beyond the hills, in the dark mouth of the next valley, the rats began to scatter. 3 days passed. Then 4. Eldergrove waited. Time, once flowing gently like the stream beyond the western grove, now hung thick in the air. Even the children, usually wild as spring sparrows, played in hushed tones under watchful eyes. Mothers kept them closer. Fathers sharpened tools not for use, but for the comfort of having something solid in their hands. Each night, the chapel bell stayed still, per the decree. But the chapel clock never stopped. It ticked on, slow and steady, its sound more present now than ever before. It was no longer just the background rhythm of Eldergrove's life, it was the only sound that dared to defy the hush. Linnea often found herself lying awake, counting the seconds between ticks, as if they might predict something. Mela had begun to cough. Not often, not loud, just enough to make Linnea's breath catch each time. It wasn't a deep cough, and there was no fever, no darkness under Mela's eyes, only a dry clearing of the throat, like dust had settled in the corners of her lungs. Still, Linnea began crushing thyme leaves into her tea each morning, whispering little prayers as she stirred. On the 7th day, the stranger came. He did not ride a horse. He walked, from the east, down the same dirt path the riders had taken, through the gate where the old oak leaned like a sleepy watchman. His cloak was gray not from dye, but from the dust of travel. He wore no hat, and his face was half wrapped in cloth. His boots were cracked. On his back he carried no sack, no tools, only a bundle, wrapped in stained linen. It was dusk when he arrived. Father Thorn was the first to greet him, as was his calling. Linnea and Mela watched from the garden wall, the scent of basil and burning cloves hanging in the air. The sky above had turned a pale peach, as if the sun were too tired to set properly. The man did not speak. He merely knelt on the stones of the village square, unwrapping the bundle on his back. The cloth unfolded slowly, and the villagers leaned closer. Inside was a mask, long-nosed, bird-like, painted in faded whites and ochres. It looked like a carnival mask, meant to make children giggle until you saw the eyes. The eye holes were black, too black, as if they held more than shadow. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Plague doctor, someone whispered. Mela's fingers dug gently into Linea's arm, but the man shook his head. He stood, lifted the mask, and cast it into the fire pit in the center of the square. It landed without a sound. And then, he spoke. "I bury the dead." His voice was cracked like old bark, but it carried. Father Thorn, ever the shepherd, asked him gently, "You're from the coast?" The man nodded. "South, past Aaronhold. Nothing left but crows now." "And what brings you here?" The man looked at the fire pit, now smoldering with mask ash. "I follow the silence," he said. "When birds stop singing, when dogs don't bark, when children forget how to laugh, that's where it's going next." A coldness threaded through Linea's spine. "Eldergrove," Father Thorn said, steady but pale, "is still untouched." The man turned his eyes shallow, gray, rimmed in red. "Not for long. He left before midnight. No one tried to stop him." That night, the silence deepened. It wasn't the usual quiet of bedtime or snowfall. It was a silence that crept beneath doorways, clung to the rafters, and settled on the skin like soot. Linnea felt it most clearly when she went to fetch water from the back well and realized she couldn't hear the wind. The leaves moved but made no sound. Even her own footsteps seemed to pause between each step. She stood there for a long time, staring into the well, and she saw it, just for a moment, a shadow moving beneath the surface. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. Something deeper, something that had eyes. Linnea stumbled backward, water sloshing from the bucket onto her shoes. She ran inside, heart thudding like a smith's hammer. Mela looked up from her chair, knitting untouched in her lap. "What did you see, child?" Linnea opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, "It's coming." Mela nodded once. "Then we must prepare." By morning the village had changed. No one said it aloud. No proclamations were made, but a new rhythm had begun. Doors were kept shut. Bread was left on doorsteps instead of handed across thresholds. The baker wore gloves. The blacksmith worked only in the early hours, alone. And every home, every single one, began to burn herbs. Linnea and Mela worked tirelessly. Satchels were tied and handed off at arm's length. Potions brewed in steaming kettles. Fever root, wild garlic, crushed juniper. Mela's hands flew as if her fingers had borrowed time from some other clock. And yet she coughed again, only twice. But Linnea noticed. She said nothing. At twilight, she walked alone to the chapel. The doors were locked, but she knew the window on the north side was always loose. She climbed through, careful not to disturb the candles. Inside, the great clock ticked on, its hands glowing faintly in the dusky light. She stood before it and placed one hand on its face. "Please," she whispered, "keep us safe." The clock made no reply, only the quiet tick, tick, tick of time moving forward. On the 12th day since the first rider came, a child fell ill. His name was Nilo, a boy of barely 6 summers, with flaxen curls and a gap-toothed smile that once brightened the square like a spring sunbeam. He was the baker's son, often seen running barefoot, dusted in flour, pretending loaves were golden treasures only he could guard. But that morning, he did not rise. His mother, Myrna, found him tangled in sweat-drenched sheets, cheeks flushed crimson, breath shallow. A black swelling had begun under his arm, round and angry like a poisoned apple. When she touched it, he whimpered, as if the world had grown too loud. The news traveled like smoke, swift, curling, unstoppable. By the time Linnea arrived with Mela, the house had already been wrapped in cloth windows sealed with soaked linen, and rosemary branches hung at the doorframe like a prayer against the unseen. Father Thorn stood at a distance, holding his cross not like a symbol, but like a blade dull with fear. Inside, the air was thick and still. Linnea had never seen such stillness in a home. Even the fire had stopped crackling. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. Mela moved quickly, speaking little. She pressed cool compresses to Nilo's brow. whispered to the mother to boil more water, crushed fever root with shaking hands. Linnea tried to help, but her fingers trembled too much when she tied the cloth around the boy's chest. "It's early," Mela murmured as she worked. "There's a chance." But her eyes said otherwise. When they stepped back outside, the entire village was watching. No one approached. No one spoke. Only eyes. And behind those eyes, a dread blooming like mold beneath the skin. Mela turned to Linnea. "We must burn more herbs, not just bundles bonfires." Linnea nodded. "And the others?" Mela's voice was steady. "They must not come near the boy, nor the mother." The baker, Nilo's father, came that evening. He stood 20 paces away from the sealed house, holding a loaf of honey bread wrapped in cloth. "He likes this," he said quietly. Mela walked forward, took the loaf, and placed it inside the doorway without entering. When she returned to the baker, she placed a hand on his chest. "Pray from here," she said. "It is the only way to hold him now." That night, the village lit fires, one in every garden, one beside every home. Flames that once brought warmth and joy now flickered like lonely sentinels under the stars. Smoke curled through Eldergrove's lanes, thick with lavender, mint, myrrh, and tears. Linnea sat beside the fire, outside their cottage, eyes reflecting orange. She held the scroll Mela had given her, the one written by her ancestor. She unrolled more of it, reading by firelight. The sickness wore no boots, yet its footsteps shook the soul. "We lit fires not to see but to keep the dark from swallowing our names." She read it again, then again, as if each repetition might hold a secret she had missed. Mela joined her with 2 mugs of warm nettle tea. She sat slowly, her breath catching for just a moment as she lowered herself to the stool. Linnea noticed. "You're tired," she said softly. Mela gave a thin smile. "I'm old. That's different." "No, it's not." Mela looked at her long and hard. "You'll need to be ready, Linnea." "For what?" "For when I am not." The words felt like a stone placed gently in her hand, Chevy. Quiet, undeniable. 2 nights later, the second child fell ill. Then a woman. Then the tailor's apprentice. One by one, the black fruit bloomed beneath arms, along necks, behind knees. The swellings buboes, Mela called them in a whisper, came with fevers, with bleeding from the mouth, with coughing that sounded like someone drowning on dry land. Eldergrove no longer whispered. It wept. Doors remained shut. Food was passed with sticks or ropes. The chapel stayed locked. And even Father Thorne ceased preaching. Instead, he knelt day and night at the altar, lighting candles until his hands blistered. The only sound that did not change was the clock. Tick, tick, tick. Time moved forward, with or without mercy. Linnea worked day and night, helping Mela grind herbs, mix pastes, whisper prayers. Sometimes she visited the sick, placing damp cloths on foreheads, speaking softly to children who could no longer reply. But more often, she stayed outside. By then, Mela no longer left the cottage. Her cough had deepened, and though she said it was only from smoke, Linnea knew better. She could hear it now, when Mela slept wheezing like wind through cracked stone. Still, Mela taught. She passed on recipes, mixtures, warnings, and names. Names of herbs that grew in summer only. Names of oils that kept fever from the brain. Names of poisons that killed gently when death came begging. "We heal when we can," Mela said one night, her voice hoarse. "And we comfort when we cannot. That, too, is our craft." Linnea held her hand tightly. Neither of them cried. The fire outside burned low. The wind began to stir again. And in the east, far beyond the forest's edge, a strange bird cried once in the dark, low and long, like the world exhaling. Morning came in colors the sky had not worn before. There was no blue, no goldenly, a soft gray, tinged with lilac, like bruises on the clouds. The sun peeked out not with warmth, but with distance, casting no true light, only a memory of it. Eldergrove stirred, as if half awake, a village dreaming with its eyes open. Linnea stood in the garden, hands stained with mint and soot, watching the fire she had just rekindled. The smoke lifted into the air in slow spirals, as though it, too, were unsure whether to rise or fall. She had learned now how to read the smoke when it drifted straight. The air was still and afraid. When it swirled like this, something had shifted. Behind her, Mela was not moving. She had not risen at dawn, as was her habit. Nor had she asked for tea or the bundle of cloves they always placed by the window. Her breathing was softer now, softer and thinner, as if she were exhaling more of herself with each breath. Linnea stepped inside quietly. The cottage was dark, though the shutters were open. Light had simply forgotten how to enter. Mela lay on the bed beneath the woven quilt, her hands resting atop her stomach. Her eyes were closed, her lips parted slightly, murmuring in a language Linnea didn't know. Not words, exactly. Names. Names of herbs. Names of people. Names of places that no longer existed, perhaps never had. She spoke like someone traveling in sleep. Linnea pulled a chair close and sat beside her. She reached for Mela's hand, finding it cooler than she had hoped. "Grandmother," she said softly. "It's morning." Mela's eyes opened, just barely. They looked at Linnea but didn't quite see her. Then a whisper, "Do not let the flame go out." "I won't," Linnea replied, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I promise." Outside, the smoke began to drift east. By noon, the baker's house was silent. A single black cloth had been hung across the door. Nilo was gone. His mother, Myrna, still sat inside, her eyes vacant, hands pressed to her lap like she had forgotten what hands were for. No one spoke to her. No one approached. The bread oven had not been lit in days. Father Thorne placed a candle on the chapel step and said a quiet blessing. He no longer rang the bell, and in the meadow just beyond the field, small mounds had begun to appear. 3 at first, then 5, then more. The soil had turned soft with use. That evening, a storm gathered without warning. Not thunder, not lightning, but a storm of movement. Crows, dozens of them, swirled above the village like smoke with wings. They landed on rooftops, on the chapel spire, on the well's wooden post, silent at first. Then they began to call. Loud, harsh, unsettling. The villagers looked up, some with fear, some with wonder. "It's an omen," said the miller's wife. "They smell the dead." "No," whispered old Bram, who rarely spoke. "They smell what's still hiding." Whatever the reason, the crows did not leave. They roosted that night, in the boughs of the elder trees, filling the grove with restless eyes. And that night, Mela stopped speaking. Linnea stayed by her side. She brought cool cloths, brewed teas, read aloud from the old scrolls. But Mela no longer responded. Her chest rose and fell, each breath a little further apart. Her body was still, and yet her presence filled the room, as though her spirit were already beginning to step beyond it. At dusk, Linnea lit every candle in the house. She placed lavender bundles at the windows, tied rosemary to the door. She sat in silence, listening to the ticking of the clock tower in the distance, as regular as a heartbeat. When Mela opened her eyes again, it was deep into night. The candlelight flickered on the lines of her face, and for a moment, her gaze was clear. She looked at Linnea, really looked, and smiled. "My little bloom," she whispered. Linnea's throat tightened. "You're still here. For now." Mela's hand moved slightly, gesturing to the wooden box on the shelf. "You must take it." Linnea stood and brought it to her. Inside, beneath the old scrolls and faded herbs, lay a small pendant, a circle of dark wood encasing a dried flower blue as cornflower, delicate even in death. Mela's voice was faint. "It was my mother's." She said it holds the memory of spring. Linnea placed it over her heart. Mela nodded, then closed her eyes, and did not open them again. Outside, the wind began to cry. It slipped beneath doors, rustled the eaves, and rattled loose shutters. The fire in the garden hissed and swayed. The smoke lifted not in spirals now, but in long ribbons drifting westward, away from Eldergrove, as though taking something with it. The crows watched silently from the trees, and the chapel clock ticked on. Linnea did not sleep that night. She sat beside Mela's body, not weeping, not speaking, just sitting. As the hours passed, she began to hear sounds from the village. Doors creaking open, feet shifting on floorboards, the rustle of fabric. Fear moving from house to house like a cold wind. In the morning, she rose. She washed Mela's hands and braided her white hair. She dressed her in her lavender-colored shawl and placed a single sprig of sage beside her heart. Then she lit the herbs. The smoke rose soft and sweet, curling through the cottage like a goodbye. When Linnea emerged, carrying the wooden box, the villagers watched from their windows. Some crossed themselves, some turned away, but Father Thorn stood at the chapel gate, waiting. She walked to him and placed the box in his hands. "She taught me everything," Linnea said quietly. Father Thorn nodded, eyes wet. "And now you will teach us." From behind him, the chapel bell gave a single, unbidden chime. Just one. Then silence. And then the wind changed again. The day after Mela's passing, Eldergrove changed once more. It did not cry aloud, nor did it crumble, but it shifted, like an old tree leaning just slightly more toward the wind. The villagers walked more slowly. Their gazes lingered longer at empty chairs. The fires in the gardens burned lower, not because wood had run out, but because spirits had dimmed. Linnea moved through it all, like a figure from a half-remembered dreamer, face pale. Her braid streaked with ash, and her fingers always smelling faintly of thyme and earth. She did not speak much, but when she did, her voice carried with it the quiet authority of someone who had passed through a doorway and not fully returned. The pendant around her neck swayed with each step. Within the dark wood, the preserved flower glowed faintly in the morning light, like a spring long gone, but not forgotten. Children began calling her the girl with smoke in her hair, and none dared tease her. Her first act, as Mela's heir, was simple, yet solemn. She walked to the Eldergrove, alone, carrying a bundle of Mela's herbs wrapped in white linen. The path was silent, no birds, no bees, not even the wind spoke, only the soft tread of her boots on moss and the whisper of cloth against her hip. At the grove's center, beneath the tallest tree, the one Mela always said had roots that reached beyond death, Linnea knelt. She unwrapped the bundle and laid each herb in a circle. Rosemary for memory, sage for passage, lavender for peace, yarrow for healing. Then, from her pouch, she took a small clay bowl. She lit the herbs within, letting the smoke rise and curl through the branches. "I offer this for those who have gone," she whispered, "and for those who may yet stay." The smoke answered by lifting gently toward the canopy, and though no wind stirred, the leaves above rustled softly, as if in reply. Word of Linnea's ritual spread. By evening, others had begun placing their own offerings beneath the trees. Tiny bundles of cloth, prayer beads, wooden carvings, even pebbles shaped like hearts or stars. It was not a shrine, not in the way the chapel was, but it was something sacred, something quiet, something theirs. Father Thorn did not protest. He simply began visiting the grove at sunrise, pressing his hand to the bark and whispering his prayers where no one could hear. But even as the grove became a place of solace, the village itself began to unravel further. More houses bore black cloth. The tailor, the candlemaker's wife, the butcher's eldest daughter, each taken by the illness. And with each loss, the space between the living grew wider. Neighbors stopped waving. Children played only in their gardens, never crossing paths. Couples who once danced together by lantern light now sat apart, afraid even of each other's breath. The disease came in waves, sometimes quiet, sometimes cruel, but always certain. It did not knock or whisper. It simply arrived. And still the crows watched. Linnea did what she could. She delivered bundles of herbs to doorsteps. She left vials of oil and satchels of spice near windows. She wrote down every remedy Mela had ever taught her, binding them into a single scroll she carried on her hip like a sacred text. When someone knocked on her door, and they often did, they never stayed long. They came, eyes downcast, and whispered, "She's fevered," or "He's begun to swell." And Linnea would nod, gather what she needed, and set out, always with a candle in hand and smoke at her back. She did not speak of hope, but her presence offered something close to it. One evening, as twilight folded the village in shades of blue and violet, Linnea returned home to find something left on her doorstep. It was a loaf of honey bread, still warm, wrapped in cloth embroidered with a tiny golden star. She stood for a long while, holding it in her hands, the scent of cloves and honey rising into the dusk. Then she looked to the chapel. Its windows were aglow with candlelight, and Father Thorn was waiting by the gate. She walked to him, silent as always, and placed the bread in his hands. "She left this," Linnea said simply. He nodded. "Myrna." "How is she?" "Quiet, as if listening for someone who won't return." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Linnea asked, "Will the stars ever feel close again?" Father Thorn looked up. "They're not far," he said, "but the night has grown thicker." And that was all. That night, Linnea sat in Mela's chair, a kettle brewing on the hearth. She opened the scroll once more, writing new entries with her careful hand. For coughs that do not leave, boil licorice root with lemon balm. For fear, burn sandalwood and lavender. Sit near someone who remembers your name. For grief, plant something, anything. Let it grow in silence. She stopped, then wrote one more line. For when the world forgets how to breathe, light a fire and breathe for it. She set down the quill. Outside, the fire in the garden danced. And though the air was still, the smoke lifted high into the star spiraling, not like mourning, but like memory. The fires never went out, day and night. The smoke coiled like sleepy dragons through the streets of Eldergrove. At first, it had been for protection. Now, it was ritual. It gave the illusion that something could still be held at bay, even as the sickness crept into more homes, more hearts. There were now 27 black cloths fluttering at doorways, 27 names Linnea carried in her chest like stones. She did not cry. Tears, she had learned, were water, and water had no power over what burned beneath the skin of the dying. Instead, she lit more fires. She carved more bundles, and she walked the village like a priestess of the old world, wordless, tireless, draped in the scent of smoke and myrrh. One morning, as she was returning from the grove, she saw a small figure sitting on the chapel steps. A boy, thin, pale, no older than 10. His clothes were patched in too many places, and his shoes had holes in both soles. Yet he sat upright, with hands folded in his lap, watching the world as if he were older than the stones beneath him. Linnea slowed as she approached. The boy looked up and said, "You're the one who walks without fear." Linnea paused. "I walk with fire." He nodded solemnly. "Same thing." She sat beside him without asking. They said nothing for a while. Then he said, "My sister is sick." Linnea turned her eyes to him. "What's her name?" "Daya. She's 15. Strong. Or she was." "Where is she now?" "In the barn. Mama says the walls are better there. Thicker." He paused. "She coughs until the straw moves." Linnea placed a hand over the pendant on her chest. "Have you burned anything for her?" "I tried. but the smoke made her cry, so I just sit here and wait. She looked at him for a moment, then reached into her satchel. From within, she pulled a tiny jar honey-colored, thick with crushed herbs suspended in oil. She handed it to him. Rub this on her feet and her chest. Only a little. Sing if you can. The voice carries more than smoke sometimes. The boy stared at the jar. Will it save her? No, Linnea said softly, but it may make the darkness gentler. He nodded, tucked the jar into his sleeve, and ran down the road without another word. She watched until he disappeared behind the old mill. That evening, as the wind picked up and the clouds rolled low over the village, Linnea stood outside the chapel gate. Father Thorn was lighting candles along the altar inside. His face was gaunt now, his robes loose, as if he were slowly vanishing from within. Still, he lit each flame with steady hands. When he saw Linnea, he opened the door and beckoned her in. I haven't rung the bell in days, he said. It feels like it might scare them. Linnea entered quietly and knelt before the altar. The old wood was warm beneath her hands, as if it still remembered sunlight. I came to ask a favor, she said. He turned to her gently. Ask. I want to bury the next one. Father Thorn blinked. You? She nodded. Not with prayers, with herbs, with the way Mela taught me. The old way. There was silence. Then he said, You will have to be alone. I already am. He closed his eyes for a moment, then touched her shoulder. Then let it be so. 2 nights later, the bell rang. Just once. A woman named Aleph, the village midwife, had passed. Linnea was waiting by the gate before dawn, wrapped in her dark cloak, her braid tied back, a bundle of rosemary and white ashwood in her arms. No one followed her. She walked to the burial meadow alone. The fog was thick, clinging to her ankles, swallowing the grass in silver silence. A single spade had been left by the marker stone. She knelt beside the grave that had already been dug, her breath calm, her mind steady. She placed the herbs first, then the linen, then Aleph, wrapped gently, reverently. No words were spoken. Only a soft chant told and nameless that Mela had once hummed while laying lavender across a newborn's crib. Linnea covered the grave slowly. Then, from her satchel, she took the pendant from her neck. She pressed it into the soil at the top of the mound, letting the dried flower face the sky. For memory, she whispered, and turned away. When she returned to the village, the air had shifted. No one greeted her, but many stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of recognition, as if something in her now belonged more to the forest and flame than to the flesh and breath of common life. The girl with smoke in her hair had buried death with her own hands, and death had not taken her. Not yet. That night, the stars emerged again, only a few, scattered and pale but there. Linnea stood in her garden, watching them flicker like faraway lanterns. She thought of Mela, of the boy on the chapel steps, of the girl named Daya coughing in the straw, of Aleph, of the baker's son, Nilo, and of all the names not yet spoken aloud. She did not pray, but she hummed, a song without words, and the smoke from her fire rose gently toward the stars. The wind came back with the dawn, not the frightened hush of before, nor the scentless drift of illness. It was a true wind now, one that pushed through alleyways and rattled shutters, one that lifted loose thatch from roofs and sent old parchment flying like lost birds. Eldergrove stirred beneath it, as if waking from a long-held breath. Linnea stood at her cottage door, hair unbound and loose in the breeze. She wore Mela's shawl now, though it had begun to fray at the seams. In her hands, she held a string of dried cloves, an orange peel, small, fragrant, simple charms meant to hang over cradles and hearths. But there were fewer cradles now, fewer hearths still burning, and fewer doors left unlatched. In the center of the village, The chapel bell rang again, once, twice, then fell silent. No one had died, not this time. Instead, it was a summons. Father Thorn had called a gathering, carefully worded and carefully timed, during the 1 hour of each day when no coughing was heard, no smoke burned, and the sky was not yet cloaked in dusk. The villagers came slowly, uncertain. They gathered in the square, wrapped in cloaks, faces hidden behind cloth and distance. Some leaned on canes, some stood alone, some held small trinkets or rosaries between their fingers like lifelines. Linnea arrived last. She stood at the edge, apart but visible, a girl of 13 winters, marked by ash and memory, eyes too steady for her age. Father Thorn stepped forward. His voice was soft, but it carried. "My friends," he said, "we are not untouched. We are not unscathed. But we are still here." A few heads nodded. He went on. "We have seen suffering. We have seen loss. We have laid to rest those we love. But we have also seen something else. We have seen courage in quiet hands. We have seen healing, even when death waited outside the door." He looked toward Linnea. She did not move. "She has not been chosen by the Lord," he said, "but by something older, something rooted deep in the ground beneath our feet. The same ground we bury our dead in. The same ground that grows our food. The same ground where our elders walked and prayed before there was parchment to write it." A murmur rose in the crowd. Some looked at Linnea with awe, others with unease. "She speaks with herbs," he said, "but more than that, she listens. Then simply, let us do the same." After the gathering, Linnea returned to her garden. The fire was low. The herbs she had strung that morning were now waving gently in the wind, filling the air with notes of citrus and clove. She knelt and began sorting dried nettle from feverfew, her hands moving without thought. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. It was the boy from the chapel steps. His name, she had learned, was Elias. His cheeks were ruddy from wind, his eyes round with something that might have been hope or fear, or both. "She slept last night," he said. Linnea looked up. "Dea?" He nodded. "She still coughs," he said. "But it's not deep anymore, like it's moving out." Linnea felt something warm stir in her chest. "I think your singing helped," she said gently. Elias smiled a quick, crooked thing, as though his face had forgotten how to. Then he pulled something from his pocket and held it out. It was a little bird, carved from wood. "I made it for your window," he said, "so the wind doesn't feel so lonely when it passes." She took it carefully. It was simple. A sparrow, smoothed by small, earnest hands. "Thank you," she said. Elias nodded once and ran off, as boys do when they've given too much of themselves in a single moment. That night, Linnea hung the bird by her window. It turned gently in the breeze, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. But peace never lingered long. The next day, the rats came. They slipped through cracks and scurried beneath floorboards. They chewed through grain sacks and nested in the woodpiles. Not many, not yet, but enough. Enough for the crows to take flight from the Eldergrove and circle the rooftops again. Linnea saw the first one at dawn, perched on the chapel's highest stone. It looked directly at her window. She stared back, heart suddenly still. Then, from the distant hills beyond the forest's edges, saw the rising smoke, a column, straight and high, from another village, one she did not know, one that had not burned before. That night, the wind changed again. It carried something sharp this time, not the scent of herbs, but the scent of fire and sickness and the iron tang of something ending. Mela had once said, "When the air smells like coins, the veil between things has thinned." Linnea stood at her threshold, hand resting on the wooden bird, watching the trees bend in the distance. A single word came to her lips. Not a spell, not a prayer, but a name, Aracel. She did not know why she said it, only that it felt like unlocking something. Something waiting. Just beyond the next hill, no one spoke of the rats, though everyone saw them. They moved like whispers along the edges of walls, and the seams of shadows quick, silent, and always watching. The cats had vanished weeks before, and the dogs no longer barked at night. It was as if all creatures who could feel the shift in the wind had already begun their retreat. Only the crows remained, watching, waiting. The children had stopped asking when it would end. Instead, they counted the number of chimneys with no smoke. It became a quiet, gay morbid, yes, but gently so. Like everything else now, it had softened with repetition. And in the heart of Eldergrove, the chapel bell gathered dust. Father Thorn still lit his candles, still offered prayers behind locked doors. But the pulpit stood empty. No sermons echoed through the narrow streets. Even the stained glass no longer caught sunlight, only the pale silver of clouds heavy with silence. Linnea kept to her rituals. Each morning, she lit a bundle of rosemary and juniper on the garden fire. Each afternoon, she walked the village with a satchel of balm and scrolls. Each evening, she wrote in Mela's book an entry for the sick, one for the healed, and one for the lost. She did not speak much, not because she feared the sound of her own voice, but because the world itself seemed quieter, as though it now moved beneath a great glass dome, fragile and thick with memory. She dreamed more now, not of crows or of Mela, but of someone standing just beyond the tree stall, veiled in gray, face hidden beneath a hood. The figure never moved, never spoke, only stood, as if waiting for her to speak first. And each time she woke, the name Aracel echoed faintly, as though the trees had whispered it while she slept. She asked Father Thorn once, in the low light of the chapel, "Have you heard the name Aracel before?" The old priest paused for a long time, then said, "In the oldest hymns, the ones we no longer sing." "What does it mean?" "A gate," he replied, "or a guardian. No one's sure anymore. The word is older than the stones." Linnea did not ask further. Some truths were like seeds, they grew best in silence. That week, 3 new graves were dug. But something had changed. The illness came faster now. One day of fever, then the lungs would fill. The swellings no longer took days to bloom, they appeared overnight, dark and tender, pulsing like a second heart beneath the skin. Linnea stood at the foot of a cot where a man lay gasping for breath. She had seen his wife only 3 mornings before, hanging herbs above the hearth. Now both of them were gone. Their cottage would be boarded by dusk. And still the rats came. Their eyes glowed in alleys. Their feet pattered across rooftops. They crawled over bread left too long outside, chewed through twine and rope, nested in corners where firelight didn't reach. Linnea took to burning rue and mugwort in every room she entered, but she knew it was no longer enough. The sickness had quickened, and something in the air was turning. One night, the fire in her garden flickered strangely. It danced in spirals, as if pulled upward by invisible hands. The smoke did not drift, it climbed, straight, strong, silent. Then she heard it. A knock. Not at the door, at the back window. She froze. The wind was still. The stars, faint and few, watched without blinking. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. She rose, every part of her body moving as if through water. At the window stood a woman. She wore a black cloak soaked from the dew, and her face was lined, but kind. Her hands were clasped before her, and in her eyes was a sorrow so ancient it did not need to speak. "I'm sorry to come at night," the woman said, "but I have no one else." Linnea opened the door. The woman stepped inside, her steps unsure, like someone unused to shelter. "My name is Idria," she said. "I've come from the other side of the forest, the village of Mossrest." Linnea blinked. "The smoke." "Yes," Idria said quietly. "It was ours." She unwrapped a cloth bundle from beneath her cloak. Inside were black feathers and pale petals, bound with silver thread. "We sent this offering," Idria said, "to ask for help, or maybe to send a warning." Linnea touched the feathers gently. "In the village?" Idria's voice broke. "Gone. All of it. Moss rest. The cottages. The fields. The people. Some buried, some not. Some fled and never returned. I stayed," she said, voice shaking. "I buried what I could. The rest, I could not carry. I walked until the wind led me here." Linnea offered her tea. Idria took it with both hands, trembling. After a while, she said, "The figure in the trees. You've seen it too, haven't you?" Linnea looked up sharply. "Yes." Idria nodded. "They say Aerosel walks before the storm." That night, Linnea could not sleep. She sat by the window, the wooden bird turning softly in the wind. Across the village, only 2 fires burned, and in the farthest field, beyond the Eldergrove, she saw something glowing. Not a star, not a lantern, a light beneath the ground, as if the earth itself had begun to pulse. Morning arrived slowly. The light came not in a burst, but in a hesitant trickle, like water leaking through cracks in a stone jar. The clouds hung lower than ever, soft and colorless, as if the sky had forgotten how to be blue. Linnea watched from her window, eyes on the place where the fields met the forest. The light she had seen the night before was gone. No trace of flame, no scent of smoke, only the memory of that soft pulse beneath the ground. She stepped outside. The garden was still. The herbs had curled in on themselves, their leaves puckered from too much wind and too little warmth. Even the lavender, once proud and stubborn, drooped its violet heads toward the soil. Linnea crouched and pressed her palm to the earth. It felt warm, too warm, as if the land itself had a fever. Inside, Idria was still asleep, curled beneath Mela's quilt. She had not stirred once in the night. Her breath was shallow but steady, and her fingers remained curled around the silver-threaded bundle of feathers she had brought from Mossrest. Linnea lit the kettle, then sat by the fire, tracing the edge of her wooden pendant. She did not speak, nor hum, nor move much at all. Her thoughts were heavy not with fear, but with waiting. It was as though time itself had begun to lean. By the time Idria woke, the kettle had long since cooled. "I heard something," she said, her voice husky. "In the dark, like voices buried beneath stone." Linnea stirred the embers. "You dreamed." "No," Idria said. "I listened." They ate quiet lithan broth, 2 pieces of root bread, and dried berries soaked in warm cider. Neither spoke of the sickness. Neither asked how many black cloths now hung on village doors. Those numbers had lost their meaning. What mattered now was how the wind moved, and what it carried with it. Later that day, Linnea walked with Idria through the Eldergrove. The trees were still strong, but the birds had all gone. Their branches bore no nests, no chirps, no motion, only the weight of time and the hush of things holding their breath. At the center, they found the offerings. Still there, still untouched, but something had changed. The ground beneath the offerings had cracked thin, jagged lines, like veins spreading outward. The soil was dry, the moss no longer green. Idria knelt beside it. "This is where the veil is thinnest." Linnea looked down at the cracks. "What lies beneath it?" Idria did not answer at first. Then quietly, "Memory, and perhaps more." That night, Father Thorn came to their door. His cloak was soaked, his hands trembling slightly. He looked older than Linnea had ever seen him, his shoulders stooped, his eyes dimmed like lanterns on their last drop of oil. He stepped inside without waiting to be asked, and sat beside the hearth, as if he had always belonged there. "I've seen it," he said. Linnea offered him tea. He accepted but did not drink. "The light beneath the field," he continued. "It's not just in your dreams. I went out before dawn. I followed the rats. They were gathered there, silent, watching the ground. And then I saw it glow, just for a breath. But it was real. Idria sat across from him, her eyes unreadable. Father Thorn looked between them. You know what it is. We don't, Linnea said softly. But we feel it, Idria added. And it's growing. The priest set down his cup. I don't know what prayers still work, but I will keep saying them. As night fell, the wind changed again. This time, it came not with cold or silence, but with voices. Soft, layered, like 1,000 people murmuring just beyond hearing. Linnea stood in the garden, the wooden bird by her window creaking in the breeze. Idria stood beside her, clutching the feathers to her chest. They said nothing, only listened. The voices did not frighten. They remembered. They sounded like lullabies half forgotten, like stories grandmothers whispered over sleeping babes, like promises buried in the soil with names that no longer had tongues to speak them. And beneath their feet, the earth grew warmer still. At midnight, Linnea returned to the Eldergrove alone. She brought no fire, only silence. The cracks in the soil had widened, small, but noticeable, as if something beneath the ground was pressing upward. She knelt and placed both hands on the earth. Are you Erisel? She whispered. The grove did not answer, but the wind paused, and for a breathless second, every tree leaned slightly toward her, as though listening. She stayed there until morning. By the time the first birds returned, just two, quiet and uncertain, the cracks had closed. The moss was soft again, and the warmth beneath the soil had faded. Idria found her there just after dawn. You called, she said, and something heard you. Linnea rose, her limbs stiff, her heart heavy. They're not done speaking. No, Idria agreed, but perhaps they've remembered who to speak through. They walked back to the village together. The crows no longer circled, but high in the bell tower, a single raven perched larger than the others, feathers tinged with silver. It watched them without blinking, and beneath its perch, the great clock ticked louder than before. The raven remained on the bell tower for 3 days. It did not move, did not call, only watched. Its feathers shimmered like wet ink, and a faint silver dust seemed to gather along its wings, catching the light in ways the other birds never did. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the Watcher, the one who waits, or simply the quiet wing. Linnea watched it too, from her window, from the garden, from the chapel path. Each time, it met her gaze, and each time, the ticking of the chapel clock grew louder in her ear stick. Tick, tick, not frantic, but firm. A rhythm old as stone, older, perhaps. Mela used to say the clock knew more than it told. Linnea whispered to Idria one night. Idria glanced up at the raven. Then it is time it started speaking. The sickness, oddly, began to slow. Not disappear, but slow. No new cloths were hung that week. The fires burned lower, not from despair, but because people had begun to hope the worst might be behind them. The coughs grew lighter, and the swelling came less often. But the silence did not lift, nor did the waiting. Father Thorn resumed walking through the village each morning, staff in hand, murmuring blessings. He no longer knocked on doors, but placed sprigs of thyme and laurel on each doorstep. He still looked tired, but less like a man crumbling, and more like one learning to stand again. And Linnea began to dream again. But this time the veiled figure stepped forward. In the dream, she stood in the Eldergrove, moonlight falling like silver threads through the trees. The air pulsed gently, like breath. And from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was not monstrous, not cruel. It was tall, robed in gray, and its hands were folded as if in prayer. Linnea did not run. She simply asked, "Why are you here?" And the figure replied not in voice, but in thought, a warmth behind her eyes. Because you asked. When she awoke, she found a white feather on her pillow. The next morning, Idria left. She had packed her few things, mostly herbs Linnea had given her, a wrapped loaf from the baker's widow, and the silver-threaded bundle from Mossrest. I must go, she said, eyes soft. I have work in the south. A new village, one with no herbs, no healer, no name yet on the maps. Linnea did not argue. She only hugged her gently, fingers pressing to her back like a blessing. You'll walk with fire, Linnea said. Idria smiled. And you'll speak with the earth. They parted at the edge of the Eldergrove, where the trees leaned just slightly inward, as if forming a doorway only those with quiet hearts could see. For 2 nights after, Linnea lit no fire. She simply sat in the garden and listened. To the leaves, to the wind, to the space between ticks of the clock tower. And on the 3rd night, she heard a whisper, not from outside, but within the earth. It came not as words, but as a knowing, a presence, brushing against her awareness, like a hand trailing across fabric. She stood and walked barefoot to the grove. No lantern, no herbs, only the pendant at her neck and the feather in her hand. The grove welcomed her with silence, not emptiness, but attention. She stepped to the center, where the cracks had once been, and knelt. The soil was cool now, damp with dew. She placed the feather down and closed her eyes and breathed. She did not know how long she knelt there. Time in the grove moved like mist, shifting, shapeless. But she knew when the presence arrived. The air thickened, not heavy, but dense with meaning. The trees did not sway, but every branch seemed to lean, just slightly, in her direction. Then a voice, not hers, rose from the dark. Do you still wish to carry it? Linnea's heart stilled. She opened her eyes. The grove was still, but the voice remained. It echoed not in her ears, but inside her chest. She nodded. I do, even if it costs you? She swallowed. Yes. There was a pause. Then we give you what remains. The ground pulsed beneath her hand. Just once, like a final heartbeat. And the wind sighed through the branches. Not mournful, not joyous, just present. Linnea stood slowly and walked home. At dawn, the raven was gone. The bell tower was empty, but on the chapel steps, someone had laid a single bundle. White yarrow, lavender, and the tiniest scrap of silver thread. Linnea picked it up with both hands, and for the first time in many weeks, she smiled. Not a smile of victory, but of knowing that something had turned, and the silence no longer waited to consume, but to speak. The sun rose with a faint breath of gold, not bright, not triumphant, but enough to cast thin shadows through the lacework of trees. In Eldergrove, the frost on rooftops melted just a little earlier than it had the day before. For the first time in many weeks, someone opened their window without looking both ways. Linnea sat in the garden, her fingers curled around a warm cup of thyme and cider tea. The wooden sparrow still hung from the window, its wings swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere behind her, a rooster called, not strong, but steady, like a voice remembering how to sing. The air was quieter now, but not empty. It was the quiet that comes after a story has been told, when listeners hold their breath, letting the last words settle in their chest. She felt it in her bones. The turning had begun. By midday, the chapel bell rang once. No one had died. No one had summoned it. It rang on its own. Father Thorn found Linnea soon after, just outside the Eldergrove. She was gathering soft moss in a small basket, humming a lullaby Mela used to sing while stirring pots. You felt it too, he said. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She nodded. Something shifted. The wind is listening, he added. Linnea looked up toward the sky. It's always listened, We just forget how to answer. They sat together beneath the wide-branched elder tree, watching sunlight dapple through thinning leaves. You've become more than your years, Father Thorn said. You carry the quiet like a second heart. Linnea smiled faintly. I've had many teachers, even the stillness. The priest hesitated. Then, have you seen it again? Linnea didn't reply at once. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the white feather she had found on her pillow after the dream. I don't need to see it again, she said. It walks behind me now. That evening, she returned to the meadow beyond the village, the place where the earth had once glowed. It was no longer pulsing, no longer warm, but in the soft curve of the grass, she saw something new. Flowers, tiny ones, not planted, not scattered by wind, growing. A thin patch of crocus pale purple, faces turned toward the sinking sun. They bent gently with the breeze, swaying like dancers, soft and certain. Linnea knelt beside them. She didn't touch them, just breathed. Then, from her pocket, she pulled out the oldest scroll in Mela's box, the one her great-great-grandmother had written. The first words Linnea ever read aloud after the sickness was named. She unrolled it slowly, and beneath those ancient, trembling lines, she added something new. The silence did not mean death. It meant listening. As dusk fell, the crows returned, but not in flocks, not circling, not calling. Just one, then another, then a third. They perched along the rooftops, the well post, the chapel's edge. They did not speak, only watched as if curious what came next. And then, as stars began to blink through the violet veil of night, a sound rose from the grove. Not a cry, not a wind, a note. High and low at once. Thin, but clear. A kind of tone, like the rim of glass touched by a steady finger. It carried through the village like a thread of silver, unbroken, untouched. Every fire paused, every candle flickered, and everyone stopped to listen. Even the crows turned their heads. Linnea stood in her doorway, heart thudding not with fear but with recognition. That, she whispered, is the veil. She followed the sound, barefoot, no cloak, no herbs, no lantern, only her pendant, and the scroll she had written upon. The villagers watched her pass, silent. None called her name, but all turned toward her, as if pulled by the gravity of her quiet. Father Thorn stood at the chapel's threshold, hands folded. He did not stop her, only nodded. At the grove's entrance, the air shimmered faintly. Linnea stepped beneath the trees. The music grew softer, but closerless like sound, more like memory, like lullabies never sung aloud, like wishes never dared, like names forgotten, even by the wind. In the center of the grove, she saw them. Figures, dozens, not of flesh, but of shadow and silver, light and time. They stood among the roots and stones, tall and bowed, robed in age. None moved, none spoke, except one, the figure from her dreams. The veil lifted, and Linnea saw not a face, but a shape behind the veil, an echo of herself. Older, wiser, still. The figure raised one hand, and in its palm lay a seed, no bigger than a tear, but glowing like dawn. Linnea stepped forward and accepted it. It pulsed in her hand once, then vanished. And in its place, a warmth spread through her bones, gentle, ancient, familiar, like holding spring in her chest. The grove exhaled, and the figures faded. When Linnea stepped from the trees, the music had stopped, but something lingered in the air. Not fear, not silence, a stillness full of promise. She looked to the sky. No crows, no clouds, only stars. And beneath their glow, the elder trees stood taller, as if they too were waiting for what came next. Winter came not with storms, but with a hush. The snows fell gently, layering Eldergrove in white like linen, laid over a sleeping form. Icicles clung to rooftops like silver teardrops, and the air tasted of stillness and old wood smoke. In the silence of early mornings, the only sound that remained unchanged was the clock in the chapel tower. Tick, tick, tick. Each beat was softer now, less insistent, as though even time had paused, uncertain whether to continue forward or rest just a while longer. In Linnea's garden, the herbs had withered, their dried stems bent beneath frost, their roots tucked into frozen earth. Yet in the corner, where crocuses had bloomed unexpectedly weeks before, one petal still held on translucent and pale, like glass kissed by the last light of dusk. Linnea sat by the fire inside her cottage, Mela's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. A bowl of lentil stew steamed quietly in her lap, untouched. Her thoughts wandered not in fear, but in remembering. She did not know what the seed truly was, only that it had been given. And in the giving, something ancient had turned in her bones like a lock clicking open after generations of silence. Outside, the village moved like breath, slow, careful, but alive. Fewer homes were shuttered now. Smoke rose again from chimneys, not out of desperation, but habit. The baker's wife, though still thin and wan, had reopened her oven, and the scent of honey bread curled once more through the alleyways. Children began to play again. Quietly, yes, and always near home. But laughter could be heard again, drifting between rooftops like the first bird calls after a long, gray rain. And no new black cloths had been hung in over a month. They had not yet dared remove the old ones, but they no longer added more. The turning was no longer just felt. It was seen. One morning, Linnea stepped into the chapel. Father Thorn was sweeping the stone floor, his robes worn soft as parchment. He paused when he saw her, then smiled thinly, but truly. "I wondered when you'd return," he said. "I came to ask for light," Linnea replied. He raised an eyebrow. She gestured to the altar. "The candles. I'd like one to carry." He nodded, reached beneath the lectern, and brought out a fresh beeswax candle. As he passed it to her, their fingers touched, and she felt something pass between them: respect, certainly, but also release, as though he too had been waiting for someone else to carry the quiet forward. Outside, she lit the candle from the chapel's flame. Then she walked. She moved through Eldergrove in silence, holding the single light in both hands. The snow muffled her footsteps, and the flame barely flickered in the still air. Door by door she paused, not knocking, not speaking, just standing. And one by one, the villagers stepped out to see. The butcher's widow, the miller's sons, the candlemaker's daughter with her soot-smudged apron. Even Elias, the boy from the chapel steps, now taller, holding a carved wooden fox in his hands. They watched as Linnea made her way through the square, across the frozen creek, and up the path to the Eldergrove. The candle burned steady, its flame golden against the blue-gray of snow and sky. When she reached the grove, she turned. The villagers stood in clusters behind her, some holding herbs, some empty-handed, some with tears already in their eyes. She stepped beneath the trees, and they followed. In the center of the grove, the ground was bare of snow, a circle of earth, soft and dark, ringed with moss that still held green. Linnea knelt and placed the candle in the center. Its light danced upward, caught in the tangled fingers of elder branches. Then, from her satchel, she drew the scroll, the same one passed through generations. She opened it with careful hands and began to read not aloud, not with her mouth, but with her presence. Her eyes moved across the old ink, and the villagers stood still, listening. Though no sound came, they felt the words more than heard them. "We did not fight the dark. We did not burn it back. We did not flee its weight. We learned to hold each other, to kneel where the wind knelt, to light one ember and let it live." When she finished, she placed the scroll beside the candle, then turned to face them. No speech, no decree, just a single question. Will you carry it with me? And one by one, they stepped forward. Each person knelt and added something to the fire. A sprig of thyme, a feather, a ribbon of cloth, once wrapped around a loved one's wrist. No blaze roared, no great light flared, but the candle in the center glowed warmer, and the cold around them softened. As the last villager stepped back, Linnea closed her eyes. For a moment, the whole world paused, and in that pause, she felt it. Not triumph, not victory, but peace. Thin as thread, strong as root, a stillness that said, "We remember." The days that followed were not bright. They were quiet. Soft snow still fell. The sun still rose and slipped behind its veil before midday. The trees in the Eldergrove remained leafless, standing like old sentinels. But in the silence, after the gathering, something subtle had taken root. People began to hum again. It was not music, in the usual Censino flutes, no bells, but hands working dough moved with rhythm. Brooms swept stone in gentle cadence. Words, when spoken, carried warmth in their corners, like the soft wool of a well-worn scarf. Something was healing. Not fast, not loudly, but deeply. Linnea returned to her cottage, after the ceremony with the scroll in her arms, and the candle still burning. She placed them both on Mela's old table, and sat for a long while in the amber light. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only breathed. Outside, someone left a basket of dried pears and chestnuts on her doorstep. No note, just a small stone nestled on top, painted with a circle, and two lines crossing through it, the ancient symbol for shared path. She touched the stone gently, then placed it beside the feather from the dream, each offering a language of its own. The raven did not return, nor did the rats. Instead, foxes began to appear on the edges of the woods. One morning, Linnea saw a mother fox leading her kits through the frost-covered hedges behind the chapel. Their tails brushed the snow without sinking into it. When she told Father Thorn, he nodded solemnly. "Foxes are the last to flee and the first to return," he said. "They come to see if the fire is still warm." By the week's end, villagers began pulling down the black cloth. Not all at once, not ceremoniously, just one at a time quietly, without announcement. Some folded them, some burned them in small fires, murmuring blessings. Some tied them to the trees behind their homes, letting the wind decide when they would fall. Linnea kept hers. She washed it, mended the frayed edges, and stitched a single lavender sprig into the hem. Then she folded it into the wooden box beneath Mela's bed, between scrolls and dried petals. It was no longer a symbol of death. It was memory. And memory, she had learned, could be both weight and wing. The children were the first to ask if they could return to school, not because they missed numbers or letters, but because they missed sitting side by side, missed hands brushing hands, missed whispering behind lessons. And so, Linnea and Father Thorn cleared out the back room of the chapel. They swept the dust, laid down cushions of straw and cloth, hung sprigs of rosemary in the windows, and invited them in not with fanfare, but with open doors. Each child brought something to place on the center table: a pine cone, a carved figurine, a smooth river stone, a tiny loaf of bread. These were their offerings, their tokens that said, "We are still here, we are still whole, even in pieces." One afternoon, as snow began to melt into rivulets along the eaves, Elias approached Linnea's garden. He had grown taller since the first time they met, his cheeks less round, his hands more certain, but his eyes still carried that same wide, honest curiosity. "I carved something," he said shyly, holding out a small object wrapped in cloth. She opened it. It was a small tree, an elder tree, its branches twisted upward in a spiral, with a single carved bird resting at the very top. I thought maybe... He hesitated. Maybe Mela would have liked it. Linnea felt warmth rise behind her eyes. She placed the carving beside the wooden sparrow in her window. She would have loved it, she said. And they stood in silence, the kind that speaks without sound. That night, Linnea wrote in the scroll once more. The fire did not die. It became small. It moved into our hands, our eyes, our voices. Now, we carry it differently. Not to burn away the dark, but to light the corners where it once lived. She placed the scroll beside the candle again, whose wax had now melted halfway down its length. Its flame still flickered, still warm, still alive. In the Eldergrove, green had begun to push through the soil once more. Only in thin veins, only beneath the surface. But it was there. Linnea knelt in the center one morning, pressing her hand to the earth. She could feel it faint, deep, pulsing, like a heartbeat, not her own. She smiled, then whispered, "Still here." The wind stirred the branches above, not cold, not sharp, but warm and full of something almost forgotten. Promise. Spring did not arrive all at once. There were no trumpets of color, no bursting petals, or bold declarations of rebirth. Instead, it crept into Eldergrove like a shy child, one bare foot after the other, testing the earth before daring to bloom. The snow melted in hushes from the corners of windowsills, then in thin silver rivers trickling down cobblestone streets. Icicles gave way to dew, and patches of green, timid but insistent, began to thread their way through the sleeping ground. In the elder grove, the crocuses returned. They opened slowly, pale and wide-eyed, like they, too, had survived something they did not fully understand. And Linnea did not rush them. She spent her mornings in the garden, hands deep in cool soil, replanting lavender, mint, and the first soft shoots of valerian. Her fingers were calloused, her cheeks kissed pink by chill wind and weak sun. The seed, the one she had been given beneath the veil, had not grown like others. It had not sprouted in a pot or beneath her window. Instead, it had taken root inside her. She could feel it now, not as a thing, but as a rhythm gentle and steady, like a second pulse, like warmth that didn't come from fire, a knowing that couldn't be named, only carried. Sometimes, when she touched the earth, the birds came closer. Sometimes, the wind leaned in to listen. In the village, a festival was proposed. Not a grand one. Not like the old harvest feasts with music, ribbons, and tables that groaned beneath roasted meat. This one would be small, simple, an offering, a gathering of the living, Father Thorn called it, and of memory. No one argued. Each household contributed what they could. Root vegetables, dried fruits, smoked fish, a few wheels of cheese. The baker's oven worked day and night, and children decorated baskets with pine cones and dried flowers. No one wore black. Instead, they wore blue and soft brown and green, the colors of sky, soil, and the first leaves. Linnea was asked to open the festival. She agreed, though not without hesitation. When the day came, she stood in the center of the village square beneath the budding tree near the old well. The villagers circled quietly around her, familiar faces, marked by loss, by endurance, by something gentle that had survived inside them despite everything. She didn't prepare a speech. She simply took the wooden pendant from her neck, held it high, and said, "This remembers." Then she placed it on a smooth stone at her feet. One by one, the villagers came forward. They laid beside it tokens of their own, tiny shoes never worn, a scrap of cloth from a lost sister's dress, a broken pipe, a faded letter, a small spoon, a wooden toy, not to bury, not to forget, but to honor. A pile of memory, a cairn built not of grief, but of gratitude. After the offerings, they ate, they sang. They didn't dance a knot yet, but some swayed, some hummed, and some held hands without needing to speak. At twilight, the children lit small lanterns and placed them along the chapel steps. Dozens of soft lights, each flickering like a heartbeat against the dark. Father Thorn knelt before them, murmured something Linnea could not hear, then smiled for the first time in seasons. She stood beside him. Together, they watched the lanterns burn. Later that night, Linnea returned to the grove alone. The candle from the midwinter vigil had finally burned to the base. Its last wax pooled into the earth like a blessing. She buried its stub beneath the crocuses, not as a farewell, but as planting. Then she sat with her back to the oldest tree, looking up into the branches where the stars had begun to gather. No figure came from the shadows. No whisper stirred the roots, but she heard something else. Children's laughter from the village below, a song drifting faintly through open windows, the rustle of a fox moving through the underbrush, and her own breath, soft and even. She closed her eyes, let the night rest around her, and said, not aloud, but with her whole being, "We are not untouched, but we are not undone." The next morning the first bee returned. It hovered above the valerian, circled the mint, then landed gently on the crocus, near where the candle had melted. Linnea watched it work, and for the first time since the sickness came, he laughed. Seasons moved again. The days stretched longer, the winds softened, and the smell of warm rain began to thread itself into Eldergrove's breath. It was not the same village it once had been. Too many had been buried. Too many chairs remained empty. Too many names had been folded into prayer. But neither was it broken. Not anymore. The sickness had gone. No one spoke the exact day they realized it. There was no announcement, no declaration, no official end. Only the absence of cloth, the slow return of songbirds, the reappearance of laughter that lingered a little longer each time. And for Linnea, it came in the form of a single, perfect thing. A girl's voice at the edge of the grove, calling her name. It was Daya. Once pale, once coughing in straw, once watched over by a boy with hope too big for his years. Now, she stood beneath the elder trees, hair braided in gold ribbon, cheeks flushed with health. She carried a basket of early apples and a folded piece of parchment. "I wrote you a story," she said, smiling. Linnea took it with both hands, heart suddenly weightless. "I wanted you to know," Daya whispered. "We remember." That spring, Linnea taught again. Not as Mela had over mortar and pestle, with strict glances and whispered chants. She taught with walks through the forest, with quiet afternoons beside the creek, with stories shared over tea and fresh loaves, where children learned that healing wasn't only in herbs, but also in hands, in listening, in patience. She taught the names of plants, yes, but also the names of stars, of winds, of moments. Sometimes the cure, she would say, isn't what you carry in a jar, but in what you carry forward. The grove, too, had changed. Where once the trees had loomed, now they leaned gently still tall, but no longer somber. Moss grew thicker, ferns curled like smiles, and at the grove's center, where the candle had burned down to nothing, a single elder tree sapling had sprouted. It was small, but it grew, not quickly, not with fanfare, but with certainty. Linnea watered it every morning, even when it rained. She never named it. Some things, she believed, were born already knowing who they were. One evening, as summer gathered her skirts along the edge of twilight, Linnea stood once more before the chapel's great wooden clock. Its hands still turned. Its face was worn. Its tick softer now, but still it moved. Father Thorn joined her quietly. "She's steady," he said, nodding at the clock. "She always has been," Linnea replied. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sky shift from gold to lavender. Then Father Thorn turned to her. "Will you keep it now?" Linnea blinked. "The chapel?" He smiled. "The care of it. The rhythm of it. The remembering." She looked at the clock, at the bell tower above, at the candlelight, still glowing faintly through the stained glass. Then she nodded. "Yes, I will." The following morning, the villagers woke to something new. A chime. Not the bell, not the ticking, but a soft, clear tone carried on the breeze like the call of a morning dove. It came from the grove, and when they followed the sound, they found Linnea, standing beneath the sapling, holding a bell of silver and vine. She rang it once, and said, "This is not to warn, not to mourn, but to mark that we lived, that we turned, that we remembered." She rang it again, and with each note, the wind shifted, picking up petals and wishes, and carrying them beyond the hills. Elias, now grown enough to carry baskets, stepped forward and placed a ribbon of green around the sapling's base. Others followed, not as ceremony, but as offering, as witness. That night, the stars seemed to fall lower in the sky. They gathered over Eldergrove like a second canopy, glittering so brightly that even the crows paused to blink. Children lay on their backs in the meadows, pointing out constellations and inventing stories to fill the spaces between them. Linnea sat outside her cottage, wrapped in Mela's shawl, the wooden sparrow swaying gently in the breeze. On her table rested the old scroll, its edges worn, its ink faded, but beside it, a second scroll had begun to form lines written in Linnea's hand, newer but filled with the same kind of remembering. She dipped her pen and added one last line for the day. "Let the ember walk where we cannot. Let it warm those still in the shadow. Let it remind the wind of who we are." She set down the pen, closed the scroll, and let the ember glow inside her, quiet, steady, and unafraid. In the years to come, stories would change. Children would ask why the chapel bell no longer rang for sorrow, but for spring. Why herbs were left at windows, even in times of peace. Why elders walked barefoot into groves, speaking to trees as if they were family. And always, someone would answer, because once, the world turned quiet, and someone lit a fire small enough to carry. And so, dear listener, the ember remains, carried not in the hands of warriors or kings, but in the hearts of those who chose to kneel beside silence, those who planted herbs in frost-hardened soil, who whispered names into the wind, who lit one small flame and let it warm the shadows. Linnea's story, like so many others during that time, is not just about survival but about remembrance, about choosing gentleness even when the world grows hard, about letting grief teach us not what we've lost, but what we are still able to hold. In the village of Eldergrove, death passed through like a long, cold winter. But spring returned not with fanfare, but with crocuses, with laughter, with stories whispered in the elder grove. And in that return, something deeper was left behind. A rhythm of healing, stitched carefully between every heartbeat and every soft breath. Maybe tonight, as you lie in the quiet space between waking and dreaming, you too can feel that ember within you steady, warm, quiet, a part of something older, something gentle, something that remembers. Let this story settle around you like a soft blanket. Let the slow rhythm of Linnea's world remind your body that it's safe now, that it's time to rest. Thank you so much for joining me here, for sharing this peaceful moment together. If this story touched your heart, helped you unwind, or brought even a flicker of calm into your evening, I gently invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here truly means more than words can express, and it helps keep this space alive for everyone who, like you, needs a quiet place to rest. Now, close your eyes. Let go of today. Breathe in stillness and breathe out the noise. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you a night full of peace, a heart full of ease, and a sleep that wraps you in deep, healing dreams. Good night, and may your ember always glow.